And hi, this is Garland Nixon, and it is the best day of the week. And you know why? Because we have Joti Brar, and we're going to learn all kind of interesting stuff. Let's talk. Good morning, all, and it's Friday morning. We've got Joti Brar. We always have such a fun show with her. I get a great reaction. People really enjoy listening to Joti and the interactions we have with her on our channel. One of my favorite guests. So we've got an election going on, and the big discussion in our election, I believe, and I've said it from the very beginning. You know, they talk about foreign policy, all these other things. They will have an effect, but I always predict the same thing: people ultimately vote on the cost of eggs, how much it costs to raise their kids, the price of, you know, what I like to call the misery index on a day-to-day basis. And what we're seeing is the misery index in the United States is spiraling, and all throughout the West, it's spiraling out of control. It's getting worse and worse. And people see no way out. They're hoping. They're like, well, at least when Trump was in, things weren't as bad, which is true. But they're saying it's because Trump was in. And therefore, if it's because Trump was in, when you bring Trump back in, right, they're going to go down. They're going to go bad. But in talking to Joti, we have learned a lot about the misery index and what causes it. So here's my question, Joti, rhetorically speaking, of course. Can people vote their way out of this miserable existence that is increasingly destroying the lives of the working masses?
Do you want the short answer? We could have the shortest show ever. No?
Right. No. Okay, bye. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Everybody go home.
Yeah.
They can't, Garland. They absolutely can't. And it's a big con that's played on the people. This whole election circus is just that. It's a circus. It's a huge distraction machine. I have a comrade, some of your viewers may be familiar with him, Alex McKay, because he does a lot of work online also on Marx Engels Lenin Institute, Red Star Radio, various channels he has. But he always points out that from the moment the mass of the working class got the vote, Parliament's fate as a totally empty talking shop was sealed. In the early days of bourgeois parliaments, they really were places where the ruling class came together to debate one another and decide on policy. But only they had access to seats in parliament. So that was a safe space for them to do their decision making, right? 600 or however many it was at the time come together, members of different factions of the bourgeoisie, they come, they shout against each other. And so that is what bourgeois democracy, capitalist democracy actually is. It's democracy for the owners of capital. The working class increasingly felt, we should have a voice. This system isn't representing us. We need a voice. They imagined that a voice in parliament was the way to make their presence felt politically and economically in society, to have a say in the decisions that are taking place. What has actually happened is that the closer that the working class got to being able to have voices inside the parliament, the more securely did the bourgeoisie enforce its dictatorship in such a way where you don't see where the decisions are taking place anymore. Number one, the ruling class itself has got smaller and smaller and smaller. So to have a democratic discussion between the real decision makers, you can do that in the back room of a London club, right? You don't need a building as big as Parliament to represent all those interests, right? There's just a few of them, and they can get together at White's or Brooks or whatever their clubs are, and have their chat behind closed doors. The Parliament, therefore, has increasingly become a place where a whole lot of noise happens. For you, you don't have a parliament. Obviously, you have the Congress and the Senate, but the same thing. Bourgeois parliaments, these talking shops, and even before the last century, you could see increasingly that was the case. But particularly in the last 100 or so years, you've seen very much that these talking shops and then the election cycle around them are a kind of a show business. And we see that epitomized in US politics, where you're never not in an election cycle. And the news endlessly feeds you stuff about the election non-stop all year round. And again, America was or USA was the first country that had this 24-hour news channels on the TV. I remember when they started coming to Britain, and I couldn't really get my head around what was the point of 24-hour news. And now I realize it's all part of amplifying the message of the circus and creating, instead of news, we have infotainment. And now with the internet, my gosh, we're bombarded from so many directions. How many 24-hour news channels are there? I mean, you couldn't, as a way of drowning the real news, it's brilliant. Endless discussion about things which are not the point, about people who don't make decisions, about decisions that aren't important. This is a massive machine of distraction and diversion away from the fact that you are being ruled by a tiny minority class which takes decisions out of your sight, into which you have no mechanism for input. Your organizations that are supposed to represent your interests have all been taken over and co-opted and turned into parts of the state machinery. Your trade unions, your anti-war, your anti-austerity movements, all of your solidarity movements, they're all run by people who are tied to one of the party machineries. In your country, it's usually the Democrats. In my country, it's usually the Labour Party. And that party is tied to the state. Those politicians at the front, they're servants of the ruling class. They're not the ruling class. They're not the real decision makers. They're not the owners of capital. They are servants, well-paid servants, and their job is to act in front of you. I mean, and we see that phenomenon particularly well represented by figures like, for example, Volodymyr Zelensky. They got an actual actor, right, to be the front person because, he's well placed. I expect even with his coke habit, he seems to be quite good at learning speeches, and he's totally directable. He gets paid a lot of money to do as he's told by his handlers in MI6, the CIA, whoever it is who's or both of them who are kind of dictating his lines at any particular moment. And he doesn't feel any personal qualm about the fact that last month the line he was giving the public is different than what he's told to give them this month. He goes out as if last month never happens. It's fine for him. It's just the next set of lines, right? There's no sense of kind of personal honor or dignity in these positions anymore. You're a highly paid actor, lackey. They want you to look good in a suit, look convincing when you make a speech, ideally be someone like Barack Obama, handsome, black as well. It's brilliant. I tick a load of boxes, for fooling and confusing people. Have a nice sonorous voice. Deliver lines with a bit of meaning and feeling in a way that stops people realizing you didn't say anything or noticing that the thing you said doesn't match the thing that your government did. Right, this is the whole distraction machine. For me, Barack Obama's speechifying was a bit like, sometimes you get like a power ballad in pop, and something about the music makes you feel like it's so meaningful, and it connects with you really deeply, and you just love it, and you'll sing along with it really loud. But if you stop and actually think about the words, you can't make any sense of them. You don't really know what it is you're singing, and yet it feels really meaningful. Like listening to a Barack Obama speech is just like that. Hope, change, and we all stand there, I want hope, yes, hope and change. What did he actually say? What did he really promise? And then what did he do? Not he, his government, the people behind him, the regime, while he was the front guy for it, what actually happened? Did the life of all the black people in the USA get better? Did the US suddenly stop being imperialist in its nature? No, none of these things. You're muted.
Yes, wow, you hit the nail on the head there. And I think that I had a note here, but I think that the people in America have been reduced to, how can I put it? The people that sit in an audience, you know what I mean? Rather than, they're convinced that they're actors in the movie. that they're actually in the movie. They're actually, they're watching a play and they're convinced that really is the villain over there. That really is the hero over there. And somehow you're part of the play and you're involved in it. When in reality, I think we're just an audience and we get various themes. And then we go from Act 1, Barack Obama, Act 2, Trump, Act 3. And but here's the thing I want to ask you about. They were able at some point to put credible people in there, whether it was LBJ. I did terrible things, but he seemed like a smart guy. They had people that seemed intellectual and they looked smart and they could speak well and they could convince people. And now we have been, if you look throughout the West and you see the Liz Trusses, the Sunaks and the Starmers, now you look over here and you see the Biden whose brain is addled. And now we've got, I have to say, one of the stupidest people I've ever seen in my life in Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts on how they went from using credible actors to these people that couldn't be a walk-on in the latest zombie movie? If they were actually being a walk-on as one of the zombies, I mean, they couldn't be a credible zombie. How did this thing deteriorate to the point where the ruling elite don't even seem to have sense enough to put a credible actor out there in front of us anymore?
I don't think it's that they don't have sense. I think it's that they don't have the option. And really, it's because the massive and accelerating decline in people's living standards, the hollowing out. So we're in a depression, economic depression now, right, which really began in earnest. I mean, the reality is we're in an overproduction crisis, which actually began to make itself felt in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a kind of financial shot in the arm to the system. It saved it from bankruptcy at the end of the 80s. But that wealth was very unevenly distributed. There was a huge bonanza for the imperialists. They got really wealthy. For the mandarins that served them and a bunch of people sort of around that in some concentric circles, a lot of money went around because of the privatization, because of housing bubbles and privatization of social housing and such things. Some people on the right side of the working class also found their living standards going up. But a whole other section of the working class, even through that big boom where a load of money came into the system, they were getting poorer. The jobs which were being exported from the imperialist countries to places where capital could make more money by, having cheaper labor power, cheaper raw materials, fewer rules and regulations about how they operate, et cetera, et cetera. The whole justification for the system of imperialism, that monopoly capital finds that it's cheaper to do its production abroad. And steadily we have this process of offshoring, outsourcing, moving capital to set up production facilities in places where you'll make a bigger profit. It's the quest for profit is at the bottom of everything. Well, in Britain, this process had been going on since the late 19th century, even the mid-19th century, certainly the late 19th century. Hollowing out, we call it, of the economy. So places where in your country and mine, there used to be an industrial workforce physically making the products that people use and need, those enterprises have been steadily, 1 by 1, 10 by 10, shifted abroad because that makes more profit for the owners of capital. In the places where whole communities relied on those industries, nothing came to replace it. So even during that period of the post-Soviet Western economic boom, that was directly the result of looting the wealth of the Soviet Union and the former socialist republics of Eastern Europe. It was a massive transfer, a huge sucking out of the wealth that had been built up by the labor of socialist countries. That didn't benefit everybody. So we've had this, for some people, the decline has been going on since the 1970s, really obviously in front of their eyes, getting worse and worse. And so you have places where people's lives have really become really miserable over this period. And then this has been added to by the fact that in 2008, the crisis came back with a vengeance. and hit very, very hard. We had the collapse of some banks. And then as other banks were collapsing, you know, Gordon Brown and Barack Obama got together and said, no, we can't let the whole financial system fail. One bank was enough. They kind of stepped in and they bailed out the banks. They said, no, they're too big to fail. So much for the free market, right? So much for the free market. No, these banks are too big to fail. We, the taxpayer, will bail them out. So we'll use state funds to prop up these institutions, which basically means spend a whole load of money on making them solvent again. And once they're back on their feet, they will go back into private hands. We'll be left with the debt. And to pay for that bailout, we had a program of austerity. Now, that was on top of 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, 30 years of decline for very many people. Then we have hardcore austerity from 2008, which, you know, has continued to be ongoing. And of course, its effects are cumulative. Then on top of that, we had another banking crash. It was a stock market crash in 2020, which was kind of hidden from our view because they called it a COVID crisis. And when they bailed out the stock market, they said they were spending money to protect us from COVID-19. That was a lie. They weren't spending money to protect us from COVID-19. They were spending a hell of a lot of money to bail out the stock market. And under cover of health measures, they injected huge amount of money into certain sectors, in particular, big tech and big pharma. And all of that money came from essentially money printing. Money printing, which had also they'd engaged in massively in 2008 to bail out the banks. So they have this combination of printing money and borrowing money, both of which mess with the masses. Because on the one hand, if you borrow money, then the taxpayers have to pay the interest and they have to take cuts to social services in order to do that. And then on the other hand, when you print money, and especially on the scale they've been doing it in particular, when you print money, you are devaluing the currency. What does that mean? It means your pay and your pensions and your savings are all worth less. In real terms, you know, so the prices are going up and up and up, but your pay is not going up. You know, pay might go up a little tiny bit, but the prices are going up like this. So we, in the last, since 2008 in particular, there's been a really dramatic fall off in people's living standards. And then on top of that, when they launched their war against Russia, the NATO powers, the imperialists, they thought that a short, sharp economic war would tip the Russians over the edge. They completely misunderstood the strength of Russia's economy and the strength of the Russian people. They thought a bit of economic pain is going to bring down the Putin regime from within. What they meant was, we'll starve people onto the streets and they'll bring down their own government and do the job for us. And we won't have to beat Russia militarily in Ukraine if we just launch this blitzkrieg under the excuse that Russia's aggressive. Aggressive Russia has launched this terrible war. Therefore, we have to do everything possible to stop Russia. That's going to starve its people onto the streets. They're going to bring down Vladimir Putin's government. They failed. Not only did they fail, it massively rebounded on Europe in particular. And what that ultimately did was fuel our inflation crisis in two ways. One was they printed a load more money to pay for arms to Ukraine and everything that they were doing there. The huge subsidies they're sending over there fuels the inflation crisis. The other one was they cut off Europe's supply of cheap energy. That massively increased energy prices, not only because they made a scarcity, but also because the energy companies saw an opportunity. And they don't miss their opportunity because they're a monopoly cartel. So as you'll notice with energy prices, they go up when there's just a news story that there might be trouble ahead. Well, the trouble hasn't arrived. It's just a rumor, but this is a cartel business. They're like, oh, great, here's our excuse. And immediately the prices in the pumps are up. And they don't come down the way they go up, like never. Sometimes there's a mini correction down and you're supposed to be grateful it went down by 2p after it's gone up by £2. You know, oh, thank goodness it's coming down. It never comes down again to where it was. So the energy prices went insane. And of course, you know, the price of energy affects the price of everything, right? Because everything is produced using energy. So the combination of all these things means that inflation has been absolutely rampant and out of control. Fundamentally, the inflation crisis is a symptom of the capitalist crisis of overproduction. And this is why, you know, all the pledges of the politicians who are telling you how they will run the imperialist system better cannot possibly solve this crisis. The crisis of the impoverishment of the people is the result of the actions, the inevitable action of the market, the global crisis in the market, the fact that capitalist production means sucking wealth from the poor to the rich. And because of all of that, there is no way of tinkering around the edges and running this system in a way which is fair, just, equitable, balanced, stable. You can't have stable capitalism. It fundamentally isn't possible, hasn't been possible since the 1820s, right? It's never going to be possible. So all the people who are promising you a way to fix things, or telling you, pointing to somebody and saying, here's your problem, or that set of people is your problem, all they're doing is trying to keep you engaged in this wishful thinking exercise that there's a way to run this system better. But the truth is, people have been engaging themselves in this wishful thinking since the 18th century. There's a way to do this system better. And they've been engaged in trying to persuade the ruling class or come up with a system or a formula of some kind that keeps everybody happy and enables prosperity to be kind of generalized, or at the very least abolishes, you know, the worst type of poverty. The truth is, under the market, you can't possibly do those things, because it's the market's action itself which has created that poverty and continues to create it.
You know, here's what's interesting. It's like the ruling elite read Lenin about revolution. Think about this. They know everything you're telling me. I'll tell you why. Because what they tried to do in Russia, right, in the Russian Federation and all over the world, what do they say? We will impoverish the masses through sanctions, etc., right? The masses will then revolt because their lives are in misery and hell, and overthrow their government. We will create the dynamics of revolution in Venezuela, in Russia, in blah, 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 right? And then exactly, boy, Lenin sure knew his stuff. They must be sitting around reading Lenin. We're going to create a revolution in Russia. The people are going to be hungry and tired and sick and tired of being tired. They're going to overthrow the government, and then we'll move in. Here's where they screwed up. As always, they misjudged the working class. Because I've been to Venezuela, as a matter of fact. The people in Venezuela, when I went, it was far worse than it is now. But the last time I was there was 2020. The people there's lives were in misery economically, and they understood it. But when I talked to the people, they literally shook their fists. You tell the Americans we will fight for our revolution. Here's what the ruling elite in the West missed. The people in Venezuela, though they had all of the dynamics for revolution economically, they knew who caused it, and they hated them, and they were going to resist. And they understood that if they went in the direction of the ruling elite in the West, that it would only get worse. So they knew that their only way out was through that. Their revolution was not a revolution against their government. It was a revolution against imperialism. And they understood imperialism wasn't in Caracas. It was in Foggy Bottom. So the people in Russia, I believe that even if things had got difficult in Russia, that the people in Russia understood that their misery was coming from Foggy bottom, not from there. So my point being, they clearly understand the dynamics of revolution abroad, which means they understand it at home. But they always misunderestimate, as George W. Bush would say, misunderestimate the ability of the working class to discern where their misery index is arising from, and to know, no, we're not fighting back on our government. You bastards, we know you did it, and we're mad at you, not them. And we know it's your system that would make our lives even miserable. In fact, your system is dragging us down now, not our system. Your thoughts?
I think, Garland, you've pinpointed something that the ruling class consistently fails to understand, which is that the working class is capable of learning and developing its understanding. They think of us as pawns, as idiots. It's kind of built into their life to think of us that way. Because if they didn't, if they thought of us as equal human beings, how do they justify the way that we're treated under this system? You kind of can't. It's like every society that's been a class society, ever since we left the days of primitive communism, where all men were definitely equal, and entered class society with slavery, how did the slave owners refer to the slaves? Talking tools. You can't tell yourself the enslaved person is a human being and then feel all right about how you're treating human beings, especially when you're busy developing arts, philosophy, science. You know, philosophically, you're thinking about the rights of men and what makes a man and what makes for a dignified life and all the rest of it. Well, if you think that applies to the slaves, you start to have a serious, cognitive dissonant problem, right? To justify your position at the top of a hierarchical system, you kind of have to believe that the people at the bottom deserve to be where they are, and in fact don't really need to be counted at all. They're not really human beings. And the ultimate expression of that is, of course, the Nazi fascistic ideology, which we see today in Ukraine, which we see today, with the Zionists in particular. But these people are not aberrations. They are saying out loud the way the ruling class thinks of the masses. The irony is the ruling class thinks of its proxy fascist armies the same way too. Doesn't care about them either, right? They're just pawns. But the ideology with which they brainwash them is actually their own ideology. It's a reflection of how they see the mass of humanity, totally expendable, not really human at all, right? So interestingly, yes, the ruling class understands the dynamics of revolution very well. It's the basis of the social contract that the imperialists make at home, where they bribe at least a section, and at times the whole of there have been particular moments where the whole working class gets a hefty bribe. But even when that is not possible, there's always a section of the working class that gets a good bribe to keep it quiescent, to keep it accepting the system, to give it privileges which are tied to the system. And therefore they remain loyal to the system. And those people are usually the leaders of the working class movement. So even if the mass of the workers are miserable, the leadership is bribed and bought off to the point where their loyalty is to the system. They might say words about socialism and social justice, but what they mean is capitalism with kinder characteristics. And what their role is to contain the anger and resentment of the masses and stop it bursting out into revolution. And this was expressed openly in 1900, I'm not sure, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The early imperialist or British colonizer Cecil Rhodes, the one who they named a part of Africa after, the part that's now Zimbabwe, he went to a meeting in the East End of impoverished workers, saw how angry they were, their cries for bread, bread, bread. This was cited by a historian called Hobson, so it must have been early. Hobson wrote in 1902, so maybe it was like 1899 or something. So Hobson documented this in 1902, and Lenin cited it again in his book on imperialism in 1916. Rhodes said, imperialism is a bread and butter question. If we don't systematize our looting of the rest of the world, we won't be able to buy off these angry workers who are so impoverished and miserable. So he made it 1900, we're talking about basically. They were very conscious of the need to buy off the anger of their own impoverished working classes who were living in utter destitution in order to stop the rise of a revolutionary movement that would oust them from power. So it is absolutely a conscious decision, or conscious recognition of the need to buy off the revolutionary sentiments of the workers. This is not an accidental phenomenon. It's a very important stabilizer for the imperialists. They need social peace at home to be able to go out and loot the rest of the world. You know, it's why we always say, as socialists in Britain, communists, the best act of solidarity we can give to our brothers and sisters who are struggling against our common enemy abroad is to make the rule of the imperialists so shaky at home that they don't have the bandwidth to be going around the world looting everybody. You know, Palestine solidarity for us is not a question of feeling pity or sorrow or raising money, you know, to, you know, help the poor orphans. You know, as laudable as all those things might be individually, they won't change the situation or the dynamic. The fact is, the ruling class can't fight its wars if we, the workers at home, don't let it. And we are letting it. And having jumble sales to raise money for a tent in a, you know, in a refugee camp where kids can, you know, have some lessons might help a few Palestinians have some lessons, but it doesn't change the fact that the bombs are going on planes, you know, every day. And the news is spewing lies about Zionism every day and all the rest of it, all the ways in which the British people are bought off and made to look the other way. So I think when you were talking about the people in the oppressed countries standing up to imperialism, you know, there have been times where those people have had their movements misled, diverted, where they've been tricked. And it's something that the ruling class tries to do all the time. You know, for example, they were just in Georgia trying to persuade people, and they have their section of the population that's been bribed, bought off, paid to feel like prosperity and a good life means the EU and Western democratic values and all that crap. You know, they've got their section of the population that's been really coerced into that. But, you know, the Georgian people have had since 1991 to see all these values in action. And they've had all the wars and coups going on in their own country and in their neighboring countries to learn from. It's got to the point now where enough of the truth about what happened in 2014 in Ukraine, the Maidan fascist coup, the way all of that was manipulated, the way snipers were brought in, you know, all of the things the USA did to control what was happening there, which was not a spontaneous movement of the people, that was totally implanted and developed and orchestrated and massaged and directed from outside. And now you see what's become of that, you know, the sacrifice of Ukraine as a nation, of all of its, you know, proud infrastructure, you know, hard-won development that it had and prosperity. It was one of the most prosperous countries in Europe, Ukraine, in the Soviet times. Not just impoverished and privatized and sold to the highest bidder abroad, but now also thrust into fighting our brother people to the death, you know, to the massacre of a generation of Ukrainian men, and all in the interests, all on the altar, sacrificed on the altar of US and Western finance capital. Well, the Georgians are not idiots. There's enough information about all of that in front of them now for them to see, do you know what? Maybe we don't need Maidan 2.0 over here. You know, we see what it does. We see what it means. We see that when you come with your cookies, Victoria Nuland, and your promises about how our life is going to be so much better, we see what we really get. You know, don't forget the people in the former Soviet territories went from Gorbachev being shown by Ronald Reagan swimming pools in the backyards of houses in California as if this is what capitalism looks like. And if you let us in, your people are going to live like this. You know, they didn't take them to the slums of Mumbai. They didn't take them to the, you know, the neighborhoods of Haiti. You know, they didn't take them to the mineral graveyards of Congo. They flew over some rich suburb of California and said, oh, look, this is what capitalist democracy brings you. You want to get rid of all of your silly socialist ways and join us, in the modern world. Well, clearly Gorbachev, as a non-Marxist, capitalist roding, easily manipulable idiot, was up for thinking that was a good idea. But the former Soviet people have had a long time to see what that means. They've had a chance to learn. And when you were talking about, people in Venezuela enduring misery, but still fighting, let's not forget, any revolutionary process will demand, while it's happening, sacrifice from the people. Things will get worse before they get better. It's inevitable because the other side doesn't go away gracefully. They do everything they can to make your life as hard as possible. They will fight, endlessly with you. They will use every instrument at their disposal to make your life terrible, to try to force you to abandon the revolutionary path. But the question for the oppressed is temporary misery with dignity and the prospect of an escape into a civilized and prosperous life at the end of it, or misery which was permanent and increasing without dignity, where your life is increasingly in the dust. That's the choice. So the miseries are not the same misery. There's one has a future and a way out, and one is going to only get worse. And you are condemning your children and your grandchildren to abject penury and slavery in perpetuity until such time, as the capitalists find a way to just, destroy humanity completely.
What's interesting, I remember hearing someone, one of the groups in the Middle East that were fighting against U.S. imperialism, and they said, well, your people, you're losing all these people. Isn't it a mistake? Shouldn't you just capitulate and the people won't be, you won't suffer anymore, right? And he said, what about Algeria? They lost millions of people in their struggle against French imperialism. He says, would you argue that they should have just accepted French imperialism and never fought back? There are sacrifices that will need to be made. So the leaders of these various groups understand that exactly what you said, and they have made a conscious choice. Look, we're going to take a hit, and we know it, and I may be one of the people that die, and everybody in my family, we all may. But in the long run, if our society, if our group, if our people are to ever break free, we got to do it now. And so if you have a person who has said, they bring some guy in to torture him to talk, and the guy says, look, I knew when I went into this fight that if I got captured, I'd be tortured. Do what you got to do, but I'm never talking. People who have come to the conclusion that they have to make a sacrifice before the fight even starts. And I think that's why you see the imperialists, they want comfort. They expect comfort. They don't want to sacrifice, and they're fighting against people who are willing to sacrifice. So you can't win that fight in the long run.
It's really clear. Like I said before, the imperialist, it's obvious their system is well past its sell-by date, can offer nothing to humanity. If you just went on human logic, you could have a debate with the richest 5 people in the world, win the debate, say, look, it's obvious. Your rule is over. Just retire gracefully. We'll give you a job. We'll give you somewhere to live. We're going to take the stuff and get on with building a planned economy. But you know what? That's not how it works. No ruling class has ever given up its position gracefully. They do it, each time the system has changed from one system to a new system, there has been centuries of struggle for it to happen. And even after you overturn a system and a ruling class, they'll spend the next 100 years and their descendants plotting to come back, fighting more wars. Look at Britain, look at France, the history of the most recent revolutions, the capitalist revolutions there. The rule of the British bourgeoisie was not firmly established until, 100 years after the English Civil War. The same in France, maybe not 100 years, but a good 50 years, upwards, up and down, backwards and forwards, the class struggle. And can't remember if it was Lenin or Stalin, but one of them was very clear, pointing out and predicted even before the revolution happened, I think it must have been Lenin, that after the revolution, the class struggle intensifies.
Right.
Because the bourgeoisie is desperate to get back to its lost paradise. And it doesn't go away. It hasn't lost its, you might have appropriated most of its property, but it still will have movable property. It still has the habits of rule. It has networks inside and outside the country of people, with influence and power. It has the education, and other people have the habit of deferring to them, and all the combination of many things means they're still, even if you don't give them the vote, even if you don't let them be in charge of the economy, they have the ability to continue to network and build. And particularly because, until such time as the socialist countries are in the majority, up until today, every socialist revolution has had to contend with the fact that on the world scale, the imperialists are still there. And they're still able to constantly fuel and funnel resources from outside. If you look at the Russian Revolution, the revolutionary process itself inside Russia to go from capitalism to communism, socialism, was very quick and relatively bloodless. Where were all the lives lost? The civil war and the war of intervention. Civil war where the powers were being backed from outside, and the war of intervention where there actually 14 countries invaded the new Soviet Russia to try to overturn its revolution. That was where all the lives were lost. That was forced on the Russian people. They didn't really have a choice. So we have to realize that it's not that we are bloodthirsty or we don't care about life or we want to throw people's lives away. We're in this because we really care about humanity. But if we're serious about caring about humanity, about getting from the system that impoverishes and wastes our lives to a system where every life is genuinely precious and fulfilled and lived in a cultured and dignified way, and where everybody's able to contribute meaningfully to the good of not just themselves and their family, but to all of society and humanity, then we have to understand realities of class struggle. It's not a tea party, as Chairman Mao famously said. You are absolutely right when it comes to dignity and humanity. Every revolutionary understands it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. We are part of a movement, part of a historical process. We accept, we say, okay, I'm fighting for the future. I'm fighting for all of society. I'm fighting for humanity. So humanity is my family. If my own family and myself have to make sacrifices, that doesn't mean that the battle is lost, or that the future that we're fighting for won't come. We are part of a chain of revolutionaries, and we all play our part. And as we've seen with the death of Yahya Sinwar, he is a perfect illustration of, again, something that Chairman Mao used to say. It's an old Chinese saying. He said, death can be lighter than a feather or heavier than Mount Tai. What he means is, and he said, a death in the service of reaction is meaningless, lighter than a feather. But a death in the service of the people is heavier than Mount Tai. It has an effect. It is part of the process of bringing history forwards. It can inspire people to pick up that mantle with more determination than ever. More people come. In my own lifetime, we saw how when the British tried to suppress the Irish liberation struggle, events like Bloody Sunday and the hunger strikes, so that one was 72, one was 81, in the north of Ireland, were the best recruiting sergeants for the armed struggle. After Bobby Sands died, despite, the first hunger striker to die on hunger strike, okay, it was a terrible loss. He was a great leader of the Republican Socialist movement and a young man, a horrible thing to have happened. He was prepared to die for his cause. He knew that his death was going to send shockwaves around the world. He had been elected to the British Parliament and they let him die in their jail. And it did indeed send shockwaves around the world. And the next day, and for weeks following, the IRA was inundated with volunteers. Now, you will find exactly the same thing happening. It's not to do with Islam or Christianity or anything else, right? When the struggle is just, when it represents the aspirations of the people, when it reflects when they've understood that they have no choice. There's no other way to get free. You can't negotiate with these people. You can't argue with them. You can't appeal to their better nature. You have to fight and defeat them. When people have really understood that, then they will pick up the banner. And Sinwar's death, you've seen, has had exactly the same effect that Bobby Sands' death had on Irish Republicans, that young men are queuing up, if they weren't already, to join the fight. In Lebanon, I've seen, all of this bombing that's been going on and the decapitation of Hezbollah leaders. It's not separated people from Hezbollah. There's plenty of people in Lebanon who are not naturally Hezbollah followers, who are not Muslim at all, or not Shia, or not religious, who might not, if they join the armed struggle, join Hezbollah. They might join a different faction. But the things that are being done to Lebanon are persuading more and more people there's only one thing to do, and that is to join the fight. And that understanding becomes a tidal wave that the imperialists are constantly feeding. Every time they try to terrorize people out of joining the struggle, they have the exact opposite effect, because we've reached a tipping point now where people have understood, they have learned. They tried all the other ways. They watched the Oslo process. They tried trusting the Americans. They tried doing Western-style democracy. Lebanon is utterly bankrupt and has been for a long time. It has a stooge government, unable to help the people out of their distress. What's the force in Lebanon that is genuinely protecting Lebanese sovereignty, genuinely trying to help Lebanese impoverished people? Well, it's the resistance. Whether it's Hezbollah or other parts of the resistance, but of course Hezbollah is the most well-known, so that's the one we tend to refer to. But it's the resistance forces that are upholding the dignity and the sovereignty of Lebanon and offering them the chance of a future without the control of the IMF and the World Bank and the sucking out of Lebanese people's resources and the constant threat of violence held over them if they ever try to do anything that the imperialists don't like.
Interesting when you mentioned that when we get to the Gaza conflict, because I always go back to this. One of my callers I have a radio show on another radio show in DC that's tonight from 6 to 7 Fridays, and somewhat more mainstream listeners, but I've attracted a lot of non-mainstream listeners there. But there was a guy who used to call all the time, and he'd say, "Oh, Garland, you're wrong. We got to support the Democrats. How come you won't vote for Hillary?" Things of that nature, right? And I would always say, "Well, we disagree, but thanks for calling. I appreciate you listening." And I felt like, hey, that's what do they say? It's the healthy don't need a doctor, the sick need a doctor. I want to talk to people that disagree with me and think the system is their best friend. That's who I want to hear. Within a couple of months after the Gaza conflict, the guy called and said, "All these years, I were wrong. You was right." It's like this Gaza conflict has done something to wake up people that there's nothing that any of us could have ever done, that people are looking at this and they're seeing all the lies that they've been told. We're standing up against autocrats, for democracy, look at the way these people are treating the LGBTQ community in this country and women, why we've got to go bomb that country into justice and morality. All of these things, the Gaza conflict has talk about how this desperation and violence has demonstrated to people who didn't understand what they were up against, has enlightened the masses in ways that nothing else could have.
I think it's really important to recognize the role that people like you play in sowing seeds. You don't get the result of every seed you sow the day you plant it. Seeds can sit in the earth for years and years and years before something happens to germinate them, but they can't be germinated if they're not there. And I think that's a really, really important thing to recognize with our type of work. When the conditions aren't right for that particular person, your message won't be responded to. But that doesn't mean it's not sat there somewhere at the back of the head. So the guy who's been listening to you and arguing all those years, okay, it seemed like you made no progress with him, but the ideas you put there are there, or he wouldn't keep bloody calling you.
Right. Good
it's
point.
Not his sense that you've got something, but he's pushing back against it. His life is like, no. He doesn't want that information to be true, and he's found a mechanism for rejecting it and rebutting it. But it's in there, and then something happened to show him that those things you've been saying that he's been pushing back against and arguing with were true. But they had to be there for that process to take place. With the Palestine situation, with the last year of us, everybody who's interested. Now, let's face it, where I live and where you live, there are a shocking number of people who are uninterested, utterly unplugged from that whole situation, don't see it. They're in a different social media bubble or whatever, or their life bubble, and they pass it by. They don't try to find out, and nobody tells them. And so, they're basically oblivious to what's going on. And it's a hard thing to see, but it's true. But for people who have been anyway plugged in over the last, throughout their lifetimes, actually, the Palestinian struggle is one that keeps imposing itself. And for many people over the years, they may have tried to work out what was going on, but they trusted mainstream media. And mainstream media says, well, it's very complicated. And there's just something about these people in the Middle East. They just can't calm down. We tried to give them a peace process, but they just keep fighting. And Islam is inherently kind of fighty, and so you just can't make peace with people who are determined to blow you up. And it's because they all think they're going to go to heaven with 1,000 virgins. And they kind of put all these things on you, and you don't have anybody giving you a different understanding. Or if you meet someone who tells you something different, they're such a small voice compared to the layers and layers of mainstream media propaganda that you're just like, I can't really make sense of this, it's too complicated. And the ruling class is very, very good at making things feel complicated and making you feel like you're just not in it. I just can't judge any of that, so it's nothing to do with me. They do that with pensions. I can't possibly understand pensions, it's too complicated, just do whatever you're going to do and I'll suffer. So they do that. They've been doing it with the Palestine situation, that they don't cover. If they can get away with not letting you know what's been happening, they don't tell it to you. And when they have to tell you something, they present it in a kind of, these people did, and then these people answered, and it's like a kind of tit for tat. There's two sides, two states, two warring parties. They're at what sometimes it calms down, sometimes it flares up. But whenever Israel does something, it's always framed as in response to some act of the resistance, which isn't called the resistance. It's called Hamas, or it's called terrorists, or it's so. The mainstream media was able to keep a lid on people's understanding in the West. Not true in the rest of the world in the same way, but in the West in particular, where we're dominated by corporate media, where we don't have much of an incentive to try to understand better, to question what the media has been telling us or the politicians. But, we've had a period, particularly since 2008, of steady decline in our standard of living, steady rise in the sense of mistrust of politicians and media. Really, that started with the Iraq war invasion, 2003. 2008 deepened it massively. We've been being told for so long, you can't have this and you can't have that. They were already starting austerity in various forms, although they didn't call it austerity, but they would just tell us, there's not really money to deliver good health service to everybody. We have to start thinking about making cuts, or we have to start privatizing things because, there's not enough money to go around. And, that sounds convincing when people stand in front of you and look sincere and say, the problem, of course, is that the populations are getting older, so we can't afford to look after everyone. Or there's too many immigrants and they're putting strain on our services. And it all sounds convincing until the day you wake up and they suddenly found, 500 million to bail out the banks. And you're like, what? What just happened? So, these things, over time, the buildup of all of these ways in which we start to see that We're being lied to, we're being manipulated, we stop trusting our politicians and our media. These are things which have been building up through the period of economic crisis. You know, you have to understand at the bottom of everything that happens in our society is economics. And the economic crisis of the system drives its drive to war. It drives the impoverishment of the masses, the austerity, the bankruptcies, and all of these things which interact with one another to leave us feeling angry and disenfranchised and distrustful of the people in charge. So we have a political crisis generally. You know, the masses of the poor working class in both of our countries now do not trust media or politicians. And there's been a whole series of events that have led to that situation. But essentially, that's underpinned by economic crisis. So here we are today. That's the case. There's a massive cost of living crisis in both countries. There's a massive crisis of legitimacy of the system. We don't believe in judges anymore. We don't believe in politicians. We don't believe in media. We don't believe in the police. We don't believe in the army. All the states, all the pillars of state power have been chipped away at and exposed to us to the point where we don't trust the lot of them, right? And then we have, of course, this genie of social media, which is a very double-edged sword. It's been totally monopolized and is mainly used against us to distract us, to divert us, to polarize us, to inflame our emotions and stop us from thinking, you know, full of clickbait and polarizing lies and distraction rubbish and a kind of, again, another kind of circus. But it's also a vehicle for directly transmitting information from one part of the world to another. Yes. Directly transmitting information from one part of the world to another, connecting people from across continents. You know, look at me and you having this conversation from two different time zones, you know, thousands of miles apart. The internet is facilitating these things. And for all of the work that's done to suppress and control that, it's not completely controllable. There's simply too much of it. A lot of information can be drowned by counter information and lies, but good information exists, it's there, people can find it. When it comes to the genocide, the number of people who have over the years built direct connections with people in Palestine or found media channels that will give them the truth or something approximating the truth outside of mainstream media means that for the last year, we've had a situation where this is unprecedented, because not the genocide, which is unprecedented. A lot of people feel like the genocide is unprecedented. It's not. In Palestine, these crimes have been going on for 75 years. They might have reached a new level of intensity, but when you look at each aspect, this has been going on for 75 years. And it's not just Zionists who do this. You know, this is imperialism in action. Go to Congo and find out what's been happening there and what has happened there for the last 150 years. Non-stop genocide after genocide after genocide after genocide. It's, you know, to the point where, you know, you can't really get your head around what that really means. Go look at the conquistadors and the Europeans discovering the Americas, you know, or Australia. Look at the history of the British in India or Africa, or, you know, any of it. You will see genocide after genocide. Even when you look at the Nazi genocide of Jews in Europe, they were following a template. If you look at what they were doing in Namibia at the turn of the 20th century, it was like exactly the same. And they didn't invent that. The Germans learned how to conduct colonial policy mainly from the British. And the British invented it because they were the first ones getting out there and doing that sort of a thing, you know. So genocide is built into imperialism. In fact, it's even built into capitalism. If you look at the early development of capital, even in the home countries, the numbers of peasants who were impoverished and killed, the numbers of poor industrial workers who were used up and thrown away while they were still children. You know, the huge numbers of people who had died. You know, in Capital, Marx documents how the industrialists actually didn't care if they got through laborers 3 generations where there should really be one, because they're using them up, exhausting them, and they're dying age 30 or age 25. As long as they have kids in that time, it's okay. As long as more, or if they're not having kids, as long as there's a constant flow of new workers coming from the countryside where we're constantly kicking people off the land, one way or another, as long as we can keep having workers to exploit and use up, we don't really care how quickly we use them up, what their lives are like, or how young they die, or any of that. So genocide is a symptom, it's an outcome of capitalist economics and imperialist economics. That's not what's new. What's new is watching it in real time on your device. And so you see in horrific detail things which in other cases you've heard about at 3 or 4 removes 20 or 30 years later. And when the crimes come out 20 or 30 years later, when there's enough a build-up of an outcry and researchers and campaigners forcing a government to make an apology, the government that was involved, the ruling class that was involved, they're all dead. And the government that makes the apology does it like this: terrible things were done in the past, and we are really sorry about that. Of course, we're not so uncivilized today. That's how people used to be. We would never do something like that now, would we? And the crimes of the present moment are still being hid. The thing about the Gaza genocide is the real-time effect. We're watching this happen in real time. And the shock, the horror, the disgust, on the one hand, everyone can see this, and yet it continues. So you have really exposed to you the nature of the system and its leaders. On the other hand, our leaders in real time. So we see the pictures of what's happening on one hand, and on the other hand, we see the speeches of our leaders. And media, politicians, all of them, lying, making excuses, covering up, pretending that they want things to be better while the bombs keep arriving on planes every day, right? All measures to facilitate these crimes continue, even as all the evidence is there of what's happening. The International Court of Justice says, that looks a lot like a genocide. Nothing happens. So the speed at which the system, its representatives, its institutions are all exposed for the people is massively accelerated. And as a result, you then have people really starting to question, what is this system? And they're asking for the first time in ways they never used to do, what is Zionism? Actually, what is it? What is it? And then who is it for, Zionism? Like, it's not for Jews, is it? What is the function of Zionism? And then people start to realize behind Zionism stands imperialism. And imperialism is our enemy, is the enemy of the people of the Middle East. And increasingly, you see all the forces of the axis of resistance saying, we know that Israel is your tool. You, when we say you, we mean Washington, we mean Paris, we mean London. And we know that our fight is against British imperialism, French imperialism, American imperialism, and our fight won't be over until all of you are out of our entire region.
I think another thing that is coming out of this, and I think it is both the kinetic and metaphorical effectiveness of Ansar Allah, Yemen, in that the word, what they want you to believe, Margaret Thatcher, right? There is no alternative. What they want you to believe is it is futile to resist. There's no way. We're just too big. We're too powerful. Don't waste your time. You can't possibly resist us. And they have two fronts. They've got Ukraine. You can't resist us. We've got all of the money. See, this is capitalism. We have capital. Do you know how much money we're giving these people in Ukraine? Russia has no chance against them. It's just Russia. They used to tell us it's a gas station with a masquerading as a country. They have the economy of Walmart. Come on. And now all this capital is going to come together. It's going to go into Ukraine and they will be overwhelmed. And what they don't realize is Russia's got steel mills. They can make bombs. They can manufacture the things. They have people who are patriotic, who are willing to give their time and work extra hard and volunteer. And all of this overcomes the capital. the people in the West are watching this. The other thing they see is, well, we're just too powerful. You can't resist. Okay, sure, Russia's Russia. It's a big country, and they're getting help from everybody. And then we look at Yemen, a small, poorest country in the world. They don't have natural resources to speak of. The natural resources they have, they can't exploit them. You know, to get, but I use exploit, but not in a negative way. They can't sell their stuff, gas or oil or whatever, to make money because the capitalists have blocked that. The only thing they got is a little bit of toughness, and they stand up. And to me, the metaphorical message of Yemen is, you too can fight back against imperialism successfully if you're willing to take a principled and moral stand.
You're absolutely right, Garland. The Yemenis have shown the exact opposite of the line, resistance is futile. Resistance is everything. Resistance ultimately is victory. If you resist and you don't give up, you will win. You will wear down the enemy because you are motivated, because history is on your side and you know it. You are not a mercenary fighting for money. You are not a tool brainwashed. You are fighting for the dignity, the future of your children and your children's children, and the future of humanity. You know you're on the right side of history. You know your enemy has nothing going for them. When you have that type of motivation and you fight, if you don't give up, you will win. And that has been shown by all of the wars that imperialism has tried to fight in the last 100 years. You know, even where they had total domination in terms of technology, they could not beat the Koreans. They could not beat the Vietnamese. In the end, it's not weapons that win wars, it's people. It's people. You talk often about General Jack's book, People's Army, People's War. I'm sure he talks about the decisive force ultimately is the people. And Yemen is showing us that absolutely. You know, for many years, I tried to follow, although we got very little news and very little reliable news out of Yemen, but I was aware that the imperialists were trying to crush Yemen and, you know, using their Saudi-led coalition, but behind the Saudis was the British and the Americans, and that was very clear. And what we almost never got in our news was news about, information about what was being done to the Yemeni people as part of that war. The blockading of their ports and the sanctions against them, the starvation of the people to try to destroy them where they couldn't destroy them militarily. They tried to destroy them with starvation. Now, again, we get pictures and news from Gaza, so we know how they're being starved and what's being done to them. How many of us were getting the same kind of information from Yemen? We weren't. And so how many of us understood that the imperialists imposed a genocidal blockade on Yemen? They lost millions of people, and millions more were starving constantly on the edge of starvation. These are the people who are fighting right now, people who have endured a starvation blockade for nearly a decade. They have lost, all of them, family members, not just to fighting and bombs, but to disease and starvation. They have watched children dying of malnutrition. Can you imagine anything more hideous than to see a baby or a little child starve to death in front of you and not be able to save them? What do you think that does to you? You know, it's meant to demoralize you and make you feel hopeless. But clearly in Yemen's case, it has made them just more desperate to win, more determined to win. They are determined. They know what their enemy is and they know who their enemy is. You will hear them always say, yes, it's death to Zionism. Zionism is our immediate enemy for everyone in the region, but we know who's behind Zionism. We know it's the British. We know it's the Americans. We will keep fighting until you are out of here. And that mentality of resistance and resilience is absolutely an inspiration to the world. I think just very quickly as well, when it comes to the resistance of states, you know, when we look at Russia and China, Venezuela, you know, they all teach us in different ways the importance for a state that needs to resist imperialism. They need sovereignty and self-sufficiency in certain prerequisites. They need strong military to defend themselves. They need industrial self-sufficiency to be able to keep their economy going. They need agricultural self-sufficiency to feed their people, because all of these things, if you're relying on the world market and imperialism has a mechanism to cut you off from the world market, and suddenly you can't trade, your people can be starved. This is the problem the Venezuelans faced. This is a problem they've actually worked to overcome. For a long time, their people were on the brink of starvation and were only saved by a severe rationing program, which kept people alive. But now they are starting to increase the rations people get and develop. They actually now are in a position where something like 90% of the food Venezuelans eat is produced in Venezuela. So that's the lesson they learned from all of this. We have to have our own industry. We have to have our own agriculture. Russia did the same. In 2014, when the imperialists started to put sanctions on Russia, they looked at their economy and said, we're weak, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable because our agricultural sector has been demolished by imperialist economics. And if we don't rebuild it, they'll be able to starve us. So after 2014, they put huge efforts into rebuilding the dairy industry, the meat industry, all kinds of food industries. They nationalized important sectors of the economy, not just so that the profits would go into the economy, but also just so they could plan them for the best defense of the people. All these things, people come closer and closer to an understanding of socialist economics when the imperialists are enforcing a siege on them. The only way ultimately to stand up to that is to do what North Korea has done, which is completely plan your economy. And then, even though you're small, even though you have, limitations because of the smallness of your territory and whatever resources are available to you there, you can survive and even thrive and develop under the most arduous conditions because you use your resources to further that struggle.
Joti, tell everyone where they can find you, where they can find more of your stuff.
Thank you. So I am Joti Brar. That's my name there. If you search me on Telegram, I have a channel. If you search me on Twitter, I'm there also. My party is The Communists is our website, thecommunists.org. Fantastic Marxist analysis of the most important things in the world. If you just search for The Communists on Telegram, you will find our channel there as well, which is a really good way of keeping up with our information. And on YouTube, we have a channel called Proletarian TV, which I thoroughly recommend to people. It's got lots of lectures and talks and speeches on, all the important topics. So it's a really good educational resource.
And for those who speak Russian, there's a guy, what is it? Russian accent, Russian accent. They do a great job. They take this work and the things that Joti and I do, and they translate it into Russian. And a lot of people in Russia have been responding that they, and people who speak Russian around the world have enjoyed that. So if you're a Russian speaker, it would be great to share that with your friends. I know we do have some Russian speakers and some people from the Russian Federation and the Russian diaspora who watch this. So share that with your Russian speaking friends so they can hear the brilliance of Joti Brar, and of course of the long many years of work that she's done to get here. And once again, everybody share this on all your social media platforms. Follow me on Rockfin. Follow me on YouTube. Follow me on Rumble, because you never know on any given day what platform they will determine that, we shouldn't be on. So share me if you can afford it. You see everything going across the bottom. If you can make a donation to the channel, be it on Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon or whatever, that's highly appreciated. Even if you can't, don't worry about it. Just share this work on all of your social media platforms. Thank you very much. We are out.